Chapter 18. The march into the shrine was painful. Every few yards another acolyte would rush up and punch Victor, Lucas, Lizard, or Row 82 in their face. Lizard was especially annoyed that he could not use his speed, but Lucas had warned him not to reveal his ability yet. They also needed to find out where Samuel and Stephanie had gone. They had been behind Lizard, but apparently had not left the shrine when they had seen him get shot. It was difficult for Lizard to focus on a plan with the obnoxious black-robed acolytes rushing up and striking him in the face. It took all the self-control he could muster not to block their attacks and strike them back. He loathed the smug looks on their faces as they rushed back and forth. "You're moving too slow," laughed one of the acolytes as they struck him again. Lizard rubbed his chin to ease the pain. "The large one is especially slow," laughed another as he struck Lizard in the back. Lizard grunted with pain and his eyes widened as he looked to Lucas. Lucas shook his head discreetly, warning against action. "And what's wrong with that one's neck?" said another as he struck Row 82 in the throat. The augment gasped for air and struggled to keep moving. A swift kick in the back forced him forward. Row 82 clenched his fists, but he noticed the warning in Lucas's eyes and relaxed. "They even brought a bratty little kid," said another as he struck Lucas in the gut. Lucas stumbled forward. He regained his balance, only to be kicked down. Felix laughed as he watched Lucas struggle back to his feet. "Yeah, what is with a kid having a key?" asked Felix. "Well, you know what they say about desperate times." The acolytes laughed. Lizard and Row 82 looked at Lucas hoping for permission, but he shook his head discreetly again. They frowned and continued moving. "So are you the leader?" asked Felix as he kicked Victor in the leg and sent him falling to the floor. "Are you the one replacing Lincoln Thomas?" Felix sped up and rushed right next to Victor's ear. "You know," whispered Felix, "when I buried my demon key in his heart, he gasped like a little boy." Felix rushed over and struck Lucas in the throat, causing him to gasp for air in pain. "Yeah," said Felix with a smile, "he sounded about like that." The demon worshippers roared with laughter. "Stop it!" shouted Victor. Felix rushed behind Victor. "Or what?" chided Felix. "What will you do?" Victor spun around, but not as quickly as Felix rushed again behind Victor and kicked him in the back of the leg, forcing his knees to bend awkwardly. An instant later, Felix rushed in front of Victor and shoved him, accelerating his fall to the ground. The acolytes laughed again as Victor pushed himself up. "That's right," said Felix. "You can't do anything. You're way out of your league." Victor straightened his back and said nothing. Felix slapped him. "Get moving," thundered Felix. The other acolytes rushed up and struck Lizard, Row 82, and Lucas again, urging them to move. Lucas closed his eyes. He hated this situation, but he knew that Samuel and Stephanie had not yet been caught. It took about 10 more minutes of torturous marching before they arrived in a prison cell. They were cruelly thrown against the walls where they were locked in shackles. The speed with which the cuffs were placed on their wrists caused lacerations, and blood trickled down the arms of each prisoner, conscious or not. Sig stirred and looked to find himself bound. He had a look of relief when he saw that Chloe was breathing. He turned and found Lucas looking at him. The steady gaze and slow breathing was a signal to stay calm for the time being. Sig smiled as he confidently waited for Lucas to come up with a strategy. "It seems you have escaped before," said Felix as he noticed the unconscious acolytes on the floor. Clearly these acolytes were not fast enough. "Shall we sacrifice them?" asked another one of the acolytes. "Of course," said Felix with a smile. The speed with which they turned on one another sickened Victor. The acolytes that had accompanied Felix drew knives and sliced up the guards that Lizard had knocked out in the escape attempt. Felix rushed from victim to victim to transfer the dark energy harvested in the human sacrifice to the keys of each of the acolytes. Lizard turned away from the sight as anger welled up in his heart. Row 82 watched carefully, as he had not witnessed human sacrifice before. Though he had personally killed many people, and he had no objections to killing demon worshippers, there was something so savage about their behavior that even he felt sickened by the sight of it. Lucas closed his eyes immediately. Victor looked over at Jennifer, who was unconscious. He was glad she did not have to witness the brutality of Felix and his followers. Sig looked at the shackles as the demon worshippers were occupied with their dark rites. They were locked about his wrists and attached to a chain that went through a welded loop in the wall. He flexed his muscles to pull the chain tightly. It seemed unlikely to him that the others would be able to use brute force to break their bonds, so he anticipated some sort of signal from Lucas. His train of thought was interrupted by the acolytes. "Thank you, Master," cried one of the acolytes as he gripped his black key. Echoes of unholy gratitude came from the other demon worshippers as they bowed humbly before Felix Light. The entire scene sickened Victor, and he was glad to see another acolyte rush in and interrupt their worship. "What is it?" asked Felix in an irritated tone. "There's a pair of divine key-bearers," replied the acolyte. Felix spun around to count his prisoners. "You're sure there are 2 of them?" asked Felix as he looked at his prisoners and counted them. "Yes, Master," answered the acolyte in a worried tone. "The large male and a tan-skinned female." "Already 9 of them again. Interesting," mused Felix. "Very well." Felix put his fistful of mirrored keys on the table in the center and pointed at 3 of his acolytes, commanding them. "You 3, said Felix. "See to it that none of my prisoners escape, or that they get killed yet." "Of course, Master," they replied eagerly. Felix and the other acolytes left the room. "Felix is going to start killing us when he gets back," said Lucas in a calm voice. "Then we need to find a way to escape," said Sig. "That will not be possible," said one of the acolytes confidently. "Well, I certainly won't be able to pick the lock, Sig," said Lucas, "and even if I could, these demon worshippers would move too fast for most of us." "For all of you," corrected another of the acolytes. "Then again," said Lucas calmly, "you have no idea how we were able to escape before." "It doesn't matter," said the third acolyte. "You don't have your keys this time." "You think our only strength is in our keys?" asked Lucas. "You underestimate us." "You are a child," laughed one of the acolytes. "Sig," shouted Lucas, "get Lizard." Lucas slipped his hand out of his shackle, scraping the flesh on his wrists as he pulled it out. The demon worshippers rushed for the door, but they were stunned still as Row 82 shrieked at them. They covered their ears as Sig tore his chain apart and rushed to Lizard. "Hang on, Lizard," he said with a smile as he grabbed the chains on Lizard's shackle and popped them apart. The demon worshippers hit Sig in the back, but a moment later, Lizard swiped the black keys from around their necks. It took them a moment to realize that they had lost their speed, but when they did, they were just in time to see Sig get to his feet and give them a wide smile. "The keys!" shouted Lucas. Lizard rushed toward the table and reached for the heap of mirrored keys as Sig delivered powerful punches to the faces and bodies of the acolytes that had been assigned to watch them. "Not so fast!" hissed the voice of Felix Light as he grabbed Lizard's wrists and flung him onto the ground. The door outside swung open as Lizard tried to scurry toward the keys again. Lizard took a solid punch to the nose and flew back. He ignored the crack he had heard that accompanied the hit and the flavor of blood as he coughed and tried to get back up, but it was hard to ignore the kick to the side. "Lizard!" shouted a voice from the door. It belonged to Samuel Godwinson. He and Stephanie were pressing their advantage over a group of at least 7 acolytes. Stephanie predicted their movements, and Samuel read her mind. It was a technique she had used before against Felix in her own time, in combination with Jonathan Knight, and it had allowed them to be competitive. Unfortunately, there were many more opponents, and both Stephanie and Samuel were exhausted from their fighting. Lizard took a violent kick to the throat from Felix Light. He flew back and choked, gagging on blood and gripping his neck to alleviate the terrible pain he felt. He looked up and saw Felix rush towards Samuel and Stephanie. Stephanie's eyes flashed with fear for a moment, but then a deathly calm came over them. Felix had swiped a knife from the body of one of his sacrificed acolytes on the ground and rushed for Samuel. To his surprise, Stephanie had thrown herself in his path. The blade cut deep, and blood oozed out of the wound. Felix stood in shock for a moment. Samuel's eyes widened and welled up with tears. Victor and Lucas called out her name, but it was Sig that tore the door from the cell and rushed toward Felix with a single purpose. Felix heard Sig's attack coming and turned toward him as Samuel began pounding acolytes around him. Stephanie watched in awe as he ignored the punches they landed and disabled 3 of them with powerful attacks. I love. Stephanie tried to mouth the word "you" as she looked at Samuel, but her eyelids felt so heavy, and everything in her vision blurred. The pain disappeared, and a moment later, so did she. In spite of the fact they knew she was gone, Samuel, Lucas, Victor, Lizard, and Row 82 shouted her name, as though they might will life back into Stephanie's pierced body. Sig, on the other hand, remained silent as he lunged forward toward the keys. Sig's raw power was impressive, and he had always had thick skin. Of course, without the heavenly shield, none of his attributes were enough to defend him from Felix Light's lightning-quick combination of blade attacks. He ignored the stab wounds in his gut and the lacerations on his arms and tried to barrel ahead toward the table with the keys. But he knew when he felt the sting of metal on his throat and his mouth filled with his own blood that he would not be able to make the distance. He turned back and looked at his friends. He tried to speak, but only a horrifying gurgling escaped his mouth. He could vaguely hear the screaming of Victor and Lucas, and before he blacked out, he heard the angry shriek of Row 82. The feeling of frailty and weakness made him shiver as he realized that he had not been strong enough to protect his precious friends. A moment later his painful breathing stopped, and he grew still. Samuel Godwinson was next to be cut down. Felix laughed maniacally as he sliced open the throat of the large man. The laughter of the acolytes joined the screaming protests of the other key-bearers. He looked to Stephanie as he slumped down. "I'm sorry," he mouthed. "I'm so sorry." Darkness overcame him quickly, and soon unconsciousness turned to deathly stillness. Lizard had pushed himself up to his knees. He knew that he probably had internal bleeding and broken ribs, and he was confident that he had a broken nose that oozed blood. He could not decide whether it was more frustrating that his divine key, which would allow him to defeat Felix Light, was only a few feet away and he could not get it, or that it was Felix Light that was defeating them. They had stood up to Abaddon. They had stood up to powerful augments. They had even defeated Felix Light before. The sting of a blade in his back suddenly took all of these thoughts away. He turned to his friends that had welcomed him, even after everything he had done. A tear escaped his eye and a smile graced his lips as death pulled Ulysses Carter away from them. "Loudmouth!" shouted Felix with a smile as he rushed up next to Row 82. "Which one of them is the sword-bearer?" Felix pointed toward Kirana and Jonathan, both of whom were still unconscious. "You will pay for this!" shrieked Row 82. Wrong answer, said Felix as he noticed them starting to stir. He rushed over and stabbed both of them in the heart. The sharp pain jolted them awake. They looked at one another in surprise. Kirana, whispered Jonathan. Jonathan, whispered Kirana. Neither of them was fully aware of what had happened as unconsciousness came again and their lives slipped away. Also, your screaming is incredibly annoying, said Felix, but I might spare you now that I feel comfortable that the key bearers that were any threat to me have been eliminated. He turned and pointed to Sig. I'm guessing that he had the shield, said Felix as his acolytes laughed. He rushed over to Samuel. He had that mind-reading thing like William Fine, announced Felix. He rushed over to Lizard. This tall guy would have been able to teleport, said Felix. He came close, but in the end I was faster. I don't know what that girl had, he said as he rushed over to Stephanie's body. Origins, maybe? He rushed back up to Row 82. Tell me, said Felix with a smile. Come closer, said Row 82 in a low voice. Felix stooped down next to Row 82 confidently as Lucas protested. Don't tell him anything, shouted Lucas as tears streamed down his face. She had the key of, whispered Row 82. Yes, asked Felix with a smile. The key of making you go deaf, screamed Row 82. There was a lingering ringing in the room, and it took a moment for Row 82 to realize that Felix had left the room and covered his ears to avoid the deafening effect, rendering his tactic useless. Lucas, Victor, and the rest of the acolytes had pressed their hands against their heads. Chloe Baldwin and Jennifer Cedar had been thrown into consciousness at the wall-rattling scream and had also pressed their shackled hands against their ears. The ringing and disorientation lasted for a few moments, but when they were able to regain their senses, it was just in time to see Felix Light thrust his blade into Row 82's throat. The choking and gurgling sounds horrified Jennifer and Chloe. Victor clenched his fists angrily, and tears poured out of Lucas's eyes. The feeling of despair and helplessness had felt worse than any pain Victor had endured. His wrists were raw from struggling against his bonds, but he did not know what else to do. Lucas was not even doing that. He was just sitting against the wall, weeping. His body shook as he quietly sobbed for the loss of his friends. Now, said Felix as he wiped Row 82's blood off of his knife. Perhaps I was being too cryptic. Let me be clear. I have recently participated in a ritual with the other demon lords in Archdemon's Hand, wherein we sacrifice several divine key-bearers. Imagine my surprise when I find there are not just the surviving 4, but 9 divine key guardians here at my secret base. I've been thinking about it, and I am wondering if there is some force or power that chooses replacements for you. The prisoners remained silent for a few moments, but finally Jennifer spoke up. It's not like that, said Jennifer. Felix narrowed his eyes and rushed next to Jennifer. What do you mean? He asked. And be careful your answer does not displease me. Don't say it, Jennifer, warned Lucas in a hoarse, weary voice. What does it matter? Asked Jennifer as she faced Felix. They are from 1,000 years in the future. 1,000 years? Gasped Felix. So that means you brought them back here. Felix's eyes widened as he stood up and looked at Jennifer. His gaze made Jennifer shudder, and his lust and hatred seemed almost tangible. What is it that you want? Demanded Victor, hoping to pull Felix's attention off of Jennifer. Felix turned to him. I want to harness the power of ultimate human sacrifice, said Felix, as though he was surprised the answer was not obvious. And if I can sacrifice one of you and discover your replacement, I could have an unending stream of extremely powerful sacrifices. It would even rival Catherine Page's child farms. "You can't control that," said Jennifer defiantly. The tattoos on Felix's face contorted as he smiled widely and squatted down next to her. He ran his fingers across her face. She tried to turn from his touch, but he grabbed her face and looked her in the eyes. "Leave her alone," shouted Victor as he strained against his bonds. "Go back to the dark cave you came from, you cockroach." "The thing is," said Felix with a sadistic smile, "I don't really like the dark. My name is Felix Light, you know. And you should feel privileged that your energies will fuel my light for centuries to come." Felix thrust his blade into Jennifer's chest. "Victor," gasped Jennifer as her eyes widened. "Jennifer!" screamed Victor. Chloe and Lucas sobbed as Felix ripped his blade out of her chest and then jammed the black key that hung about his neck into the wound. Dark fire erupted and threw Felix back for a moment as he harnessed the power of his murder. Rage filled Victor's heart, and the pain in his wrists as he fought against the shackles seemed insignificant next to the sight of Jennifer losing her life. Perhaps the constant straining against the shackles on his wrists paid off, as a link in the chain that had bound Victor to the wall snapped. Victor leapt toward Felix with a rage he had never before felt. "The keys!" shouted Lucas in his desperate, hoarse voice. Victor did not want to think about the keys. He wanted to tear Felix's heart out, but the pain and pleading in Lucas's voice made him stop in his tracks and turn toward the table. He leapt through the cage door toward the table, but stopped short. Felix had recovered and grabbed his ankle. Victor kicked against him, but Felix was too quick to be hit by his clumsy attack. An instant later, a pair of acolytes had buried their blades into his back. "Idiots!" shouted Felix. "He was no threat to me. Only the sword and shield were. You will pay for depriving me of my sacrifice." Felix rushed quickly around the room, killing his acolytes with his knife, and turned back to Victor as he grew still. He frowned and rubbed his tattooed chin for a moment. "Where was I?" he said as he laughed softly. He darted over to Chloe, sticking his blade into her chest and replacing it with his black key. A burst of dark energy threw him back again, but it was clear he was gaining power and speed with each of these dark sacrifices. Victor stirred as Felix reveled in his sacrifice. He tried to ignore the excruciating pain in his body as he willed himself to stay conscious and reached for the table. He could hear Felix get up and rush toward Lucas. "Leave me alone!" shouted Lucas. "Leave you alone?" laughed Felix. "Why would I do that?" Victor realized that Lucas had been speaking to him. Felix had assumed that Victor was dead and was still unaware of his proximity to the divine keys. But Lucas knew that Victor had a chance to survive as long as he remained unnoticed. Lucas was trying to occupy the Demon Lord's attention. He was discreetly attempting to tell Victor to escape and leave him to die. Felix had no idea that Victor could use other keys. He would never expect the heavenly sword. Victor pulled the table to the floor, and the mirrored keys fell down in a pile on the ground just a couple feet in front of him. "You're a fighter," called Felix in surprise as he whirled around. "But you are too slow for me. I can kill both of you before you can do anything." He spun back to Lucas and pulled out his blood-spattered knife. Victor reached and caught his finger around a few of the chains. He pulled them close, fighting the dizziness and searing stinging. His body seemed to be begging him to give up, but he pulled one of the mirrored keys close to him. An unseen force seemed to push him closer toward the shining relic, and as the metal brushed against his fingertips, searing pain shot through his body and pulled his wounds closed. As his pain subsided, he realized the unseen force that had helped him heal was a blast of dark energy, and that it had also thrown Felix Light onto his back. Felix's sacrifice of Lucas Flynn was complete, and it had thrown the Demon Lord off balance just enough to give Victor one final, desperate attempt to fight. Time seemed to crawl as Felix slowly rubbed his head to get his bearings. Victor scrambled for another of the 9 keys he had in his hand. They looked identical. He had no idea which of them might be the heavenly sword, but he knew his time was limited. He could buy himself time with the shield, but he did not know if it was possible to use multiple keys at once. In the worst-case scenario, he would choose the key of origins and relive the horrors he had just witnessed. He picked one and prayed for the opportunity to avenge his fallen friends. His eyes glowed along with the key he had chosen, and there was a brief flash of light. As the light died down, he found himself in a stone chamber. Felix was gone. He had chosen the space key and teleported away just as Lucas had asked. He fell to the ground and wept. Though he had escaped with his life, he had lost everyone he loved.